get the civil rights movement at least onto one piece of paper, so I listed as many events as I could fit. Just look through the list, and I want you to count how many you recognize. So if you recognize it, count it, and see, just go all the way through front and back and see how many of them you recognize. Count them. So I count 18 headings. So how many? I just mention numbers. How many do you recognize? 14. 15. Don't be shy if you got 3 or 2.
1, 3. 10, 11.
I counted 22.
So what I've done in the past is I would hand it out blank and I would have you take notes, but in the interest of time, I just put my own notes and photocopied it. So let's start with a question. Did Rosa Parks start a revolution? So take a position and give some rationale for why you think she did start a revolution or why you think she didn't start a revolution. Jasmine.
Part of me kind of doesn't think that she kind of started it because there was already a 15-year-old black woman who refused to speak before Rose was arrested. But I think because she was an older woman, they thought that was a better role model and that would kind of bring more attention. So in a way, she did it, but she kind of didn't start bus freedom riders and bus boycotts.
Does everybody see the connection between Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott? The Montgomery bus boycott lasted for I think 11 months, and finally the city of Montgomery caved and said, okay, we'll integrate the buses, okay, we'll give a certain number of drivers jobs to black people, okay. So they made because the city was going to go out of business. I mean, the boycott was so well adhered to, and most of the ridership on the bus was black people. And so it really had the power to put the city's buses out of business. And so they finally just conceded. Yeah, Daniel.
They had taxis run by black drivers to help people when people needed to die, just for the spirit of
Do you think she started a revolution?
I don't necessarily think she started it, but I think she's brought a lot of publicity to it.
What's her claim to fame then? What do you mean? What's special about her?
I guess she just brought a lot of attention towards her not getting the seat, or not saying and giving her seat to the others who didn't.
Serena.
I think that she was respected and older people took come on to it instead of when she was young and got this one defiant person. But the fact that she was older, more respected, and she wouldn't give up no matter what. That started a revolution kind of.
I think the connection is Rosa Parks to Dr. King. Was she a member of his church? If not, she knew Dr. King. And Dr. King was 27 years old at the time. And Dr. King was this young pastor of a big black church in Montgomery, Alabama. And Dr. King saw the courage of this woman, Rosa Parks. If I was asking the question, did she know or think, or was she intending to start a revolution, I think the answer is no. Did she start a revolution? I think you could argue that she did, just because of the sequence of events that took place because of what she did, right? Because of what she did, Dr. King said, holy moly, holy cow. Because Dr. King had been a student of theology and philosophy who got a PhD from Boston University or Boston College, and he had been steeped, he had become curious about Mohandas Gandhi during his PhD dissertation. And so he had studied Gandhi and Gandhi's tactics. And of course he's also steeped in Christian theology, which is supporting his nonviolent position. And so this whole nonviolent, non-cooperation with the power, he saw an opening. He saw, wow, we could bring them to their knees if we get all black people to stop riding the buses. And then, because of his position as a pastor, he was able to organize the black community of Montgomery. And then, of course, once it got going for a month and people realized it was serious, then it got national attention. And they moved the momentum. They saw, wow, we can have an impact. We can win a little victory. We can create change by our own actions. I really like this quote from Dr. King. I don't know if I quoted him exactly, but he says, I got the principles from Jesus Christ. I got the tactics from Mohandas Gandhi. So you can see there's a protest against discrimination against black people probably started in the 1620s, like 10 minutes after black people got off the boat, right? In Virginia. But the modern civil rights movement, you know, where would you start it? Where would you say it begins? Jackie Robinson entering Major League Baseball, 47. Harry Truman, executive order desegregating the military and the federal government. Would you go back to 41 when FDR's executive order guaranteed black people equal opportunity in war industries? There's a group in the 1940s, Congress of Racial Equality. They were already experimenting with sit-ins. Do you guys know what a sit-in is? John, what's a sit-in?
Not like where you lock yourself in, like a room, protesting.
In a General Motors strike, that's what they did, and they called it a sit-in. They didn't want the company to bring in other workers to start making the cars, so they just locked themselves in the factory. But in the case of civil rights, what's a sit-in? Corinne?
They would have black people go into segregated areas for white people and just sit there.
Yeah, especially public facilities like restaurants. There's the example. The one that you would definitely read about is in 1960, in the spring of 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. A bunch of college students decided that's wrong that we can't have lunch well, in those days they had department stores that had lunch counters where you could get a hamburger and french fries in downtown, department stores downtown. And black students went up to the lunch counter and sat down and said, I want a hamburger. And they said, we don't serve your kind here, you're gonna have to leave. And they said, well, we're not leaving until you serve us or arrest us. And so 22 students who had sat down are breaking the law, so the cops come and arrest those 22 more sit down. They arrest those, 22 more sit down. There's 22 seats there. They arrest them, 22 more sit down. They just have 1,000 black students who volunteer to get arrested. And so they're breaking the law. It's nonviolent, it's civil disobedience, and it's gonna get a lot of attention. And if you do it on such a scale, you'll fill up the jails, and they won't have any place to put them, and they're gonna have to be calling over to the next county, do you have any jail space? They're gonna have to get more police vehicles. They aren't gonna be able to react to burglaries or crimes that are taking place at the time. You can just handcuff the whole city government with 1,000 people, and that. So, but they were experimenting with that in the 1940s in Chicago, and in the 1960s in Greensboro, North Carolina, they dug it up again and said, let's try that. And have you seen pictures of how they were treated when they did it? White men would come in and take milkshakes and dump it on their head, or they'd take salt and pour it all over their clothes, and they'd kick them or punch them, and they were trying to get them to fight back. And of course, the philosophy of nonviolence is, you guys have all seen the film Gandhi, right? The philosophy is that you know, it says I got my principles from Jesus Christ. Jesus said, if someone strikes you on one cheek, give them the other. If somebody takes your cloak, if somebody takes your tunic, give them your cloak as well. Well, it's kind of ancient language, but just submit to the evil person. In the film Gandhi, he says, when you do that, something in your enemy changes. You evoke some kind of sympathy from them when they're slapping you and you're not doing anything. It changes the person who's perpetrating injustice on you. This is very philosophical, and it's not easy. Can you imagine playing that role? Can you imagine the courage it would have taken to play that role? So those are some of the examples. We talked some about Brown versus the Board of Education yesterday. I think you could make the argument that Rosa Parks started a revolution, not intentionally, but because the sequence of events that followed her action caused something as successful as the bus boycotts of 55 and 56. We talked about Little Rock, Arkansas yesterday, right? So the organization that Dr. King started is called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Yeah, I think I have it there in 56. SCLC, Martin King. But by 1960, a group broke off of the SCLC called the SNCC. SNCC is what they got called for short. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And you can see in my notes there at the bottom of the page, in 1960, 70,000 black students participated in sit-ins. Could you imagine? I think we live in an era where we don't see much resistance at all. Is that true of our own time? No. What are people, have you seen, even over the environment, are young people activists right now? Do you think we're seeing resistance movements in the United States right now? About anything? Are we about to? Come on, give me your thoughts. Jasmine.
I think like with resistance movements and boycotts aren't like as big or aren't as participatory as like before, because like you'll see like someone that's or says something racist and people will like want to avoid talking to them or buying their products, but like not enough people like do it, like participate in the boycott enough for like the product to have an impact or damage to like something probably
what is the name of the biggest organization of resistance that you've seen in the last decade? Which group would you say has had the most activism trying to resist injustice in the United States in the last 10 years? Stephen? Can't think of any?
Like the Me Too movement, sort of.
I think that's a good candidate.
The Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter would be a good candidate.
Women's equal pay. March on Washington.
Yeah. Which was sort of tied to Me Too, but an example of it. Well, I think the level of participation during the civil rights movement went off the charts compared to what we've seen in our own lifetime. I guess that's what the point I'm trying to make. And white people were welcomed and also participated in Dr. King's organization and in his movement. The NAACP strategy was legal. I think I pointed that out yesterday. So those early cases, there's more, but two examples are 1950 Sweat v. Painter and of course Brown. But I've got a 1960 case, Boynton versus Virginia on the backside. Supreme Court case, prohibited segregation of interstate bus facilities. So this leads to the freedom rides. Who could tell me what's a freedom ride? Maxine, you know what the freedom rides were? Avery, the freedom rides? Shreya.
They were integrated buses that rode into the Deep South, like they had destinations in the Deep South, and because they were integrated, they got a lot of resistance from white people.
Okay, so yeah, to add on to Shreya, so Brown has already been issued, and Brown is saying that public facilities must desegregate. Well, down in Dixie, they had not changed the laws. They still practice segregation. So if you went into a bus station or a park in 1960 in the South, there would be a black men's bathroom and a white man's bathroom. A black woman's bathroom and a white woman's bathroom. And the same with the buses in 1960. The blacks had to sit in the back and the whites got to sit in front. You couldn't sit a white person couldn't sit next to a black person in those southern states. But the law is, remember the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Congress can pass a law related to interstate commerce. Well, buses are interstate commerce. These companies, Greyhound or whatever, you can get a Greyhound from Maine to Florida. So what college students did in the summer of 1961 is they said, let's get a bunch of black college students and white college students and let's sit next to each other on the buses. We'll get on in New York and we'll go to Atlanta and we'll break the law and see what kind of response we get. So that was the strategy. They were going to intentionally break the laws. Okay, they were going to break the state laws, but they had the federal law at their back. So, and it led to violence. I think at least one student was killed. In Anniston, Alabama, this white mob slashed the tires right after they had gotten back on the bus after lunch. They slashed the tires, they held the bus shut, and they broke a window and threw a firebomb into the bus. And so there were 50 people in the bus with a smoke producing, and they were holding the door shut so that they couldn't get out. They were attempting to kill all of them. In some instances, they just beat the crap out of these college students with white mobs. You see how they have to keep evolving their strategies and keep testing the law That's essentially what Linda Brown did. It's what Rosa Parks did, and it's what the Freedom Riders are doing. It's what the sit-in strikes are doing. You have to use the law to provoke. I think Gandhi said it. He said, the job of a civil resistor is to provoke, and we will continue to provoke until we get a response or they change the law. James Meredith was the first African American to go to the University of Mississippi. And it took 440 U.S. Marshals and $1 million to get him registered. That's the resistance they got. Now, University of Mississippi is named Ole Miss. And today, I think today, the majority of students at Ole Miss are African American because in Mississippi, the population of blacks is so high as a percentage of the overall Mississippi population. But there was a riot that erupted. They took these U.S. Marshals, snuck James Meredith into the registration building at night and got him registered. And when the campus realized that they had registered a black person at the University of Mississippi, a riot erupted. And they used 400 and some U.S. Marshals to quell the riot that took place because one black person, and this guy was a U.S. Air Force vet, James Meredith, and I think they spent like $1 million to protect him during the 4 years that he was a student at Ole Miss. Medgar Evers was well, let's go back. 1963 in Birmingham is a turning point. So if you want to see the whole civil rights movement, the protests in the spring of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama are a game changer for the whole movement. And I'll try and briefly explain how and why. So there's this redneck, is he the chief of police? Bull Connor. His name was Bull Connor. And he's this redneck racist chief of police in Birmingham. And Dr. King's movement had gone there because they said Birmingham is the most segregated city in the South. And they were trying to get attention and rally support for segregation. So they were staging these marches, and a large number of black people would just gather and march through the streets of Birmingham singing hymns and peacefully demonstrating for segregation. And what Bull Connor was doing was arresting them. And so hundreds and hundreds of adult black people are getting arrested. And the movement put their heads together and they said, wait a second, if we get all these adults arrested, they're going to have to pay the fines, they're going to have to pay legal fees, they're going to be inconvenienced for being in jail for a week at a time, they're going to miss work, and then they're going to miss a mortgage payment. And they said, let's use children. Let's get our kids out of school and let the kids march, because if the kids get arrested, at least they aren't going to miss a week of work and you aren't going to miss your mortgage payment. So by this time, I think Dr. King was already in jail. You know, Dr. King spent a lot of time in jail, but they put him in jail in Birmingham, and he penned the most eloquent statement of the philosophy and the rationale for civil rights. It's called A Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I'm sure you've heard of it. If you take the class Mr. Webb and I are going to teach next year, we're going to analyze A Letter from a Birmingham Jail. People will be reading that document 200 years from now. But anyway, once they got the children protesting, there's this one day where they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th graders marching in the streets of Birmingham. And the city refused them a permit to protest. And so Bull Connor said, we're gonna get those damn kids off this street. get them fire hoses. So he brought out fire hoses, and he brought out German Shepherd police dogs, and he turned fire hoses and dogs against children. And in 1963, we had this thing called a television. And so all of these images were being filmed of white firefighters and white police with fire hoses and dogs attacking children who were protesting peacefully. And these footage is shown in Minneapolis and Seattle and Denver and New York. They're shown in Paris, London, Moscow. This thing went, okay, it's 1963 version of viral. And that footage was priceless because it turned Americans' opinion about the civil rights movement. Finally, Americans, the whole country, had a vested interest in the outcome of this thing. And so that was a turning point in the spring of '63, and in the summer of '63, you get the March on Washington. And I think it's 250,000 people. It's still one of the largest marches on Washington in American history, and that's where Dr. King gave that famous I Have a Dream speech. And then after that, they really don't have a lot of successes in using nonviolent civil disobedience. I still have a few minutes, right? Those two pieces of legislation that I have there are the two single greatest accomplishments legislatively of the whole civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally delivered not just the letter, but the federal government's commitment to enforce rights for black people. So that's really the major accomplishment of the Civil Rights Act comes in '64 and '65. Dr. King, President Kennedy got shot, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Texan, became president. And one of the first things he said, the best eulogy that you could give to President John F. Kennedy is to pass the Civil Rights Act that he supported. And it really does help get the Civil Rights Act passed. Also, Johnson was a brilliant legislator. Johnson had been in the Senate for 10 years before he came to the vice presidency. Say it again. Somebody say something.